It's a great pleasure to move to the novelistic imagination in Catholicism. And we have a different geography. We're looking at basically India, South Asia, and the diaspora. And as you can see, we have Narish Fernandez with us through Zoom. So everyone wave. I don't know, Narish, can you hear us? Okay, we can't hear you.
Yes, I can hear you, and sort of I can see myself looming on a screen over your head.
Okay. You loom very large over our heads. So I'm here with Jane Borges as well, who is a journalist, a novelist. I think it was Emma Mason and Bonnie who said, I want to find the Catholic imagination in India, and they said, well, you have to see Jane. So we did a Google search, and it was really through the newspaper that I found you, and it was I think through an email. Finally, I got the Gmail account, and you answered. And of course, some of us all know Randy Boyagoda. He will be with us a couple more times. He's written a book called Dante, Indiana, which was a second part of a series that he's doing. And I thought, since Jerry Pinto could not join us, another Indian poet and novelist, I asked Randy if he would help us as well. So the idea is that Jane is going to introduce herself a bit, talk about her experience as a Catholic in Mumbai, Bombay. And then Randy will do the same, and then we're going to ask Narish to kind of bring it home. And so we'll spend our first 30 minutes of just having them speak. I'll ask maybe a question, and then we'll bring it off to the audience. So without further ado, Jane, please. There you go.
Hello. Good morning, and thank you so much for the opportunity, Father Mark. And I'm so glad and grateful to be here to be talking about my small little book, Bombay Balchao. My name is Jane Borges, and I'm a journalist and novelist from Mumbai, India. I like to call it Bombay, and that's how I identify my city. That was its original name. I am a practicing Catholic, and I grew up in two cities, actually. I spent my childhood in Muscat, which is the capital city of the Sultanate of Oman. So I grew up in the Gulf, and in my mid-teens, that's when I moved to Mumbai. Both the cities are very, very different. Muscat is slow and, just very relaxed as a city, and Bombay is a lot of drama. It's chaotic, it's maddening, like any other Indian city. But in different ways, both the cities did inform my childhood and the way I grew up as a Catholic. In Muscat, we have a large Catholic population, and they were from everywhere, just not from India. You had people from Sri Lanka, you had from Pakistan, Philippines, Lebanon. So it was a vast Catholic diasporic population there, and we just had about 2 churches, not more, in the entire city. And for us, the church, because we were all from different countries, and Muscat was still developing when I moved there in the late 80s. It was a city trying to make sense of a new reality. The Omanis there were getting education for the first time, and the diasporic population was significantly contributing to the city and the country's development. So we were a very important lot back then, not as much now. But that's the city where I grew up in. And religion, I think the church was not just a religious center, it was also a social and cultural center where you came together to meet people who just did not share faith but shared your identity. And that's why the church became a very significant place. Most of our weekends were spent there. We used to have different associations. So you had an Indian association, and India in itself is so diverse. You have the Goan Christians, you have the Christians from Kerala, and they all had separate associations, so associations or groups. and they would meet during the weekends. We'd have competitions, festivals, and a lot of different things that went beyond faith. And I think that was just the way we saw ourselves together, trying to make sense in a different and a new foreign land. I remember in my childhood, we used to have what used to be called summer camps in church. I don't know if it happens here in Italy or in any part of the world, but the children would come because we didn't go back home. We'd spend our time in church, and the summer camp was where we would spend our mornings from 7 to, say, late into the evening. We'd start with a mass in the morning, and then we'd learn basketball, throw ball, and cooking, and elocution. So the church had a very different and a very informed role in shaping us as individuals, not just as religious practicing Catholics. I moved back for my higher studies in India, in Mumbai, in 2003. And for me, my parents surprisingly bought a home in a very old Catholic neighborhood in the city. And this was a neighborhood that was shrinking. So I live in this place called Kavel. It's in the south of Bombay. And when I moved there, my parents bought us a house in this very, very old building, and I didn't understand why, when Bombay was growing vertically, my parents would choose to live in a building that was almost on its last legs. But that came to embody this neighborhood for me. Everything in this neighborhood was Christian. My neighbors were Christian. The church was just a shouting distance from my house, and all our conversations revolved around the church, the parish priest, and the parish council meetings, the Legion of Mary meetings, choir. So by the way, I was very invested as a child, and even later in my teens in the church. I used to sing in the choir. I used to play the church organ. So very, very active as a Catholic, and that kind of extended when I moved to Mumbai. But it was just very, very amusing for me and overwhelming, because I grew up in a very diverse and very different kind of place in Muscat, and here I was pushed back into a neighborhood where I only was surrounded by Christians. But it made me very uncomfortable for a while, because I assumed that Mumbai is a metropolitan city. It's a melting point of so many cultures and religions. And here I am in this little neighborhood, only talking about things related to the church. But the longer I stayed there, the longer I realized the importance of being bound in this little neighborhood. It was shrinking. Kavel is a very old Christian neighborhood in Bombay, and it was one of the places where, when the Portuguese came, they began their conversions, and the earliest native Christians settled in pockets like Kavel. And over the next few centuries, from the 15th century onwards, this became a very thriving neighborhood with thousands of Christians, so much so that you had to have churches every few meters, because they couldn't accommodate the number of Christians who lived in that area. But by the time I moved there in 2003, we were about 400 parishioners in one church. And today we're just about 150, 200. So that's how soon and quickly and rapidly the neighborhood was shrinking, the Catholic neighborhood was shrinking. Most of them were moving away to the suburbs because of better housing opportunities, and also abroad, to Canada, Australia, US, you name it. And what they left behind were old, aging parents. And that is what Kavel is today. And that is why I wrote Bombay Balchao, which is inspired from this little neighborhood. And it documents 70 years of life in Kavel and to what it is in its present day. I'm going to read a very small, it might seem a little long, but I think it will give you a sense or understanding of Christianity in Bombay. Like I said, the earliest Christians of Bombay were converted in the 15th and 16th century, and they were the natives and the locals. By the time, 2 centuries later, I'd say 19th and 20th century, we see a lot of migration from Goa, Goa is another popular state in India. And the Goans were also ruled by the Portuguese. They came to Bombay for better opportunities, converted by the same Portuguese missionaries, but very different identities politically also. And that led to a lot of friction and tension between the Goan Christians and the Bombay Christians, who identified themselves as East Indians. Further down south, you have a state called Karnataka, just after Goa, where you have the Mangalorean Christians. And they all, for some reason, found themselves in Bombay, but they never got along well. And this little excerpt is set in August 1958. It's about a mother trying to convince her daughter not to marry a Mangalorean Catholic. The family is Goan. So I'm just going to read this short little bit, and it gives you a sense of the history and the way the people speak in Bombay. On her 21st birthday, Annette Coutinho, daughter of Karen and Alfred Sebastiano Coutinho, and sister of Michael, the most sought-after belle in Cavell, was finally getting engaged to her beau of 3 years, Joe Crasto. Every living person in the neighborhood, those known to the family and even otherwise, had been invited to join the celebrations at the famed Goan Catholic Club of Pious House, not very far from Pope's Colony. Annette's parents, though, weren't convinced about their daughter's choice of husband. Reason? Joe was from Mangalore in Mysore state, which was later renamed Karnataka. Aside from sharing a border with Portuguese-ruled Goa, as well as what the Coutinhos considered a lamentable version of Konkani, the Catholics of Mangalore had nothing in common with Goans. The Catholics of Bombay, for all practical purposes, were a team. They belonged to the same church, were blessed by the same pope, and worshipped the same Lord. What separated them was community, each one with its own history. In pockets like Cavell, community also determined where you stood in the realm of class. Here, it was the East Indian Catholics, the sons and daughters of the city's soil, who were the self-appointed cream of the neighborhood. Most East Indians trace their ancestry to the earliest settlers who dwelled on the islands of Bombay and neighboring Salsette. The arrival of the Portuguese and their evangelical brigade had led to the proliferation of a new group of native converts who settled in rural pockets like Cavell, where churches were being erected. One doesn't know how and when this village was Christian Cavell, but the inspiration for the name is said to have come from the local fisherfolk, the Coolies, who fished in the expansive seas not too far from here. When the British gained control of the islands of Bombay, the economy boomed, and thousands of Christian immigrants from the Portuguese state of Goa started making inroads here and in other neighborhoods in search of jobs. Overwhelmed by this massive wave of immigrants who often shared the same surnames as them, the native Christians across the islands came to call themselves East Indians. This new identity had little to do with geography. Bombay was on the western belt of India, but it had more to do with polity. Naming themselves after the British East India Company perhaps associated them with Britain. For a very long time, the East Indians of Cavell discouraged marriages outside the community. In the church, the first few rows were always reserved for the East Indians, and if a Goan dared to sit there during Mass, they throw them ugly stares before complaining to the parish priest. Things took a turn for the better when Ursula, the daughter of the Mesquitas, the richest and the proudest of East Indians, lost her heart to a Goan baker in the area and eloped with him. This act of defiance may have earned her a bad name, making her a recurring figure in Cavell folklore even 60 years after her death. But the walls had crumbled, and it wasn't long before Goan East Indian marriages started becoming commonplace. Newer walls were built when Mangalorean Catholics, just a handful, moved into Cavell. Now it was time for the Goans to make most of the newfound snobbery. Most Mangaloreans, as history documented, had once shared the same land as the Christian Goans. Their partition story went back centuries ago, to the time when the Catholic missionaries forced them to adopt a new god. While many Goan natives hadn't shown resistance to conversion, some were still deeply entrenched in Hindu customs. And so, when the Inquisition was set up in the Portuguese Goa in 1560, its autocratic policy of discouraging the Hindu way of life and the persecution that followed thereafter, along with the high taxes that were being arbitrarily imposed, didn't win favor among several locals. Worried that they were getting a raw deal, several Christians and Hindus fled southwards, resettling in regions like Mangalore. The epidemics that plagued Goa during this time only emboldened them. The price they paid for that flight of freedom had been brutal, especially after Tipu Sultan, who's the local ruler there, gained control of South Karnataka in the late 1700s and issued orders to seize the estates of the Mangalorean Catholics and hold the people captive. Thousands were killed during this time, but the Goans were too preoccupied with their own lives to concern themselves with those who abandoned them. They had started absorbing foreignness into their system, dressing, eating, and sounding like the Latins. The Mangaloreans, proud rebels as they were, saw this life of convenience that their cousins had chosen for themselves as far too easy. Even centuries on, the backstory forgotten, the resentment continued. In Bombay, Mangaloreans had earned themselves the distinction of being too shrewd for their own good, while the Goans became infamous for their laid-back attitude. None of this was true. This pigeonholing was the machination of part love, part hate, and a lot of envy. That's it. Yeah.
It's a wonderful novel. We can talk a lot about it, but I just literally finished it a couple of days ago. But the stories of this family and the vignettes going back and forth. But that was the good setup, just to see how complicated it was. Thank you very much, Jane.
Thank you, Father.
Randy, would you like to do some?
Sure. Thank you very much. I'm here as a...
Turn the microphone on.
Oh, sorry. I'm the substitute Sri Lankan on today's panel. And you'll hear more from me this afternoon in the context of Dante. So what I thought I would do is just say a little bit about how my interests as a writer intersect with my South Asian background. My parents are Sri Lankan. My father was Buddhist. My mother was Catholic, are in both cases, last I checked. And they immigrated to Canada in the 60s. And so I grew up in a pretty straightforward, middle-class, suburban, ethnic devotional household. And as a writer, I became more interested in Sri Lankan experience with my most recent set of novels, which, as Mark was pointing out, I'm in the middle of, and they're about a bike-riding Sri Lankan Catholic English professor working at a failing Catholic college in downtown Toronto, who's married to a sweet girl from Milwaukee, and they have 4 daughters together. The first novel, Original Prin, came out a few years ago, and then this is the second one. It's called Dante's Indiana, and it's about the building of a Dante theme park in an opioid-ravaged small town in the middle of America. And there's brown people everywhere in it. But what I thought I would do, this is what's nice about being kind of invited to a panel like this, is it reconfigures what you're thinking you're going to do when you come to an event like this. So one of the things that interests me is that sense that really, brown people are everywhere. Salman Rushdie said that Indians are like sand. They get into everything. And I think we could say that more generally about South Asians. And so maybe in the conversation I can say a little bit more about the diaspora and where I see Sri Lankan experience, South Asian experience, and Catholic experience intersecting in a place like Toronto. I was interested in what Jane was saying about the population decline in your town, because that same life you were describing is now in the suburbs of Toronto. Yes. Majority South Asian Catholic parishes, and the parishes are packed, and social life, community life revolves around these parishes in the suburbs of Toronto. When you live downtown, you're at a kind of an old, empty place with mostly old people and people who like to live in the city, and there's no parish life per se, but it's moved from places like India and Sri Lanka to Canada. But there are also brown people in Italy. So I thought I would read from this one section from Dante's Indiana, Partway through the book, the evangelical millionaire who's funding this Dante theme park agrees to send Prynne to Florence for research. It's part of a bit of a deal they have. And I figured this would perhaps resonate with most of you who've come from elsewhere. So just a brief selection from Dante's Indiana. I spent my first 2 hours in Italy in a lost luggage lineup. Through thick, lipstick-smudged plexiglass, I learned that my suitcase would arrive the following day and be sent directly to the hotel. In the meantime, the airline gave me a care package, a translucent toothbrush, a tiny, beautiful tube of toothpaste, its firm silver and tricolor striped paste resembling a ruddy minnow, unisex deodorant, a pack of chocolate biscuits, and a white undershirt big enough to hoist as a sail. My hotel room wasn't ready, and my phone's travel plan wouldn't be activated for another 3 hours, so I left my book bag behind the front desk, checked a map, grabbed handfuls of biscotti from a bell jar, and walked to Dante's house in cold, bright morning light. It was down a cobblestone street lined with shops and scooters and scuffy brown men standing around selling leather goods at best price, best price, best price. As soon as one of them caught my eye, he'd shoot to life and ask, "What country? What country for best price, boss? Let me guess country for best price, brother. Boss, brother." I agreed to UK, Spain, Portugal, Goa, and declined each and all the best prices. In the in-flight magazine, I'd read about a prestigious and little-known leather-making school behind one of the city's many Dante churches. I'd take my wife Molly there when she arrived the next day. Ahead of me was a narrow, dark house in a dim corner of an alley. Inside it was damp and dark wood and heavy stone hallways and steep, narrow steps, which led from floor to floor, exhibit to exhibit. What Dante and his family ate and wore, who they warred with and were healed by. I took notes and pictures. I went through the museum and reached the gift shop, where a young man in a burgundy NYU sweatshirt was begging the clerks to let him use the bathroom. Back out on the street, I saw an alley church made of rough brown brick. I stepped inside. In front of the altar, a guide stood lecturing a sheaf of tow-headed teenagers. I genuflected and sat at the back of the church on a pew the color of dark syrup. I checked my watch. There was still an hour before my phone plan started, 2 hours more before my room would be ready, 22 hours before my luggage arrived, 20 hours before Molly landed. I checked the guidebook. This had been Dante's family church, the place where he'd married Gemma Donati. It was also the Portinari family church from the 13th century onward. Many of them were buried here, including Beatrice and her devoted maid. I knelt before her grave empty-handed. But I didn't need dead flowers and letters. I could leave something living and real here instead. I began to pray. I prayed for help, for her help for me, for my marriage, for us. But Beatrice wasn't a formally recognized saint. Certainly she died and gone to heaven. She must have. How could she inspire what she inspired and not have gone to heaven? Maybe you'd get a reason or two if you asked Dante's wife. And so just in case, I also prayed for the holy soul of Beatrice Portinari, should she still be in purgatory, to be granted admission to paradise. I waited. Someone came into the church through a side door. I looked over. Did the sunlight suddenly seem just a little brighter? Was another soul seeing God face to face and refracting that glory down upon us? Maybe. Either way, once more I prayed for Beatrice and for her intercession for Molly, for us, for both of us, that on this trip we might turn back to each other, return to our life together, and to both know and want and, yes, love that this is what we were doing together. Not sursum corda, but sursum cordibus, that our lifted hearts might be one. I got up from my knees and backed away from the altar and tomb. 2 college girls wearing backpacks and clear braces, their hair in ponytails, took my place. They were clutching their phones to roses bought from the scruffy brown men at the church door. Thank you.
Thanks, Randy. Naresh Fernandez is joining us from Bombay, or Mumbai. Naresh, there you are. One of the, it was very, I have to say, if I can, a little anecdote. It was a real struggle to get visas to come to Italy. So it was a very much a sad thing. But we're just so glad that Naresh could join us through Zoom. Naresh, would you want to say a little bit about your own experience, what you do, what you're from? Your piece on St. Francis Xavier, just a wonderful piece, is part of our collection that many of us read as well. So I'll give the floor to you.
Hi, greetings to everybody from a very humid Bombay. which Jane has just left. I'm delighted to be here, and like I said, I'm quite amused at the thought that I am hovering over your heads, wraith-like. Am I audible?
Yes,
right.
yes,
Okay.
you're good.
So my father's name is Ernest Fernandez, and his parents were Alfred and Beatrice Fernandez. My mother's name is Lorna. She was born Lorna Rodriguez. Her parents were Beryl Rodriguez and Armand Rodriguez. I got my name out of this book. It's called Hindi Christian Names, and it was put together it was published in Bombay in the early 1960s. A whole generation of us, my cousins, my parents' friends, children, we all got our names out of this book, which was published in a moment of post-colonial anxiety that gripped the Christians of Western India in the early 1960s. The British had left India in 1947, but Goa, which, as Jane pointed out, a major center of Catholicism on the western coast, had been liberated or annexed, depending on your point of view, only in 1961. And in the 60s, the Christians of Western India, and especially in Bombay, felt a pressure to prove that they were Indian, that Catholicism was Indian, and that we were rooted in the soil of India. This was a moment, coincidentally, at which Vatican II had just happened, and the church was propounding the doctrine of inculturation. In 1964, there was an enormous Catholic conference held in Bombay that the Pope came for. It was the Eucharistic Congress in 1964. And that became a catalyst for a lot of these anxieties to work themselves out. In addition to this book of Christian names, there was an efflorescence of culture, of Catholic culture, that wanted to demonstrate its rootedness. So when the Pope came in 1964, there was a whole bunch of performances. There were there was music composed, Christian music composed in the traditional bhajan form of Western India, in the languages of Marathi and Konkani. There was a dance drama that was produced it was choreographed by a Czech priest who had been born George Proksh, but took the Indian name of Gyan Prakash, which means light of knowledge. An architect called Charles Correa around that time in the Bombay neighborhood of Dadar tore down an old church, a Portuguese-era church that was called Our Lady of Salvation, or Salvação, as the Portuguese pronounced it, but the British misheard it and called it Slave Song instead. Charles Correa's church was an experiment in trying to create a new kind of very Christian Catholic architecture. It didn't go down so well, that experiment. To some of the parishioners, it looked like two cement mixtures that had jammed into each other. But he got some of India's greatest artists of various faiths to paint murals. The Muslim painter M.F. Hussain painted the skylight, and Anjali Ila Menon painted a mural of Mary on one of the side passages as you enter the church. That didn't go down so well either, because she depicted Mary with dark skin. And as we all know, Mary was blonde and had blue eyes, and her hair, her skin was sort of luminous and milky white. and for years they placed a big cupboard over it so that we wouldn't have to deal with this kind of Mary. But to me, that was the moment in which I came to a consciousness of my faith and an attempt to prove and celebrate the syncretism of Indian Catholicism and of the sort of the new nation of India, which celebrated syncretism of all sorts. The sort of the big I spent a lot of time researching jazz music in India, which is a wonderfully syncretic form. It came to India in the 1930s, both sort of on shellac, but also because a bunch of African American musicians came to India to perform at that time, and they taught local musicians how to play this music. A lot of those musicians were from Goa because they had been schooled in the traditions of church music. Indian music and Hindustani music, the tradition of the North, is sort of does not have the concept of harmony. It's melodic. This again may have to do with the fact that in Hinduism you seek you seek salvation as an individual. Catholicism and Christianity is a communitarian religion, and which is sort of harmony came naturally to Catholics, or it was an demonstration of our faith, and learning and playing instruments like the violin and the trumpet and the saxophone were things that Goan Catholic musicians had learned, or Goans had learned. And when they migrated to Bombay, it became a trade. And by the 1950s, Goan Catholic musicians were an important part of the Hindi film studio orchestras. And to me, this was a wonderful celebration of how this small community actually played a very important role in creating the sound of India that all Indians love in a period that is now recognized as the golden age of Hindi film music. So it continued, the celebration of syncretism and this attempt to create a sort of Indian identity, a new Indian identity, until the 1990s, when Hindu majoritarianism has been on the rise. And since the Bharatiya Janata Party government led by Narendra Modi came to power in 2014, they have been making concerted attempts to tear apart this identity that we all celebrated. They are rewriting history textbooks. They are inventing new they're inventing traditions that they say are the bedrock of Indian identity. Some of it we will see on Sunday when a new parliament building is being inaugurated. And there's a big debate about some of the symbols that will be installed in this new parliament and the very Hindu rituals that will accompany its inauguration. I am on Twitter a lot as a journalist. I'm attacked for almost every day is my name. This name in which I am very proud, this name that to me represents a rootedness in Indian tradition. Every few hours, a troll comes after me and says, "You're a crypto-Hindu. What are you? Are you Christian or are you Hindu? Why don't you have a real Christian name like John or Rex or something of that sort?" And this is the moment at which we find ourselves now in India, and this is the moment that informs my journalism.
Thank you, Naresh.
Thanks.
So it speaks to very much the present moment. And one of the questions that I had asked everyone previously was just about that same notion of, do you see yourself as a Catholic writer? Do you see yourself, where do you see the Catholicism your upbringing, the imagination. How do you see it infecting your work, and how do you negotiate the different kinds of pluralisms that you have to kind of work in as a journalist, as a Canadian, as an academic, as an administrator to Randy, and then obviously Nareesh running this journal yourself. So maybe Jane?
Do I identify myself as a Catholic writer? Not very sure. I'm like earlier someone on the panel mentioned that, I am a writer, I am a Catholic, and I still am trying to make sense of my identity. I think we have so many identities residing within us, and they play out in different forms. I'm also a journalist. I think if I have to think about it, if my religion helps me or brings a certain sensitivity and understanding of my world through the frame of my religion, then perhaps yes. To some extent, I do see Catholicism as influencing and informing how and what I write. One of the personal motivations, apart from the fact that I wanted to document this neighborhood that was shrinking, was also to make sense of stereotypes that were perpetuating about the Catholics or the Christians as a minority. As Nareesh just mentioned, the Hindus have always been a majority, and then you have different sets of religions like Christianity, Islam, Sikhism, Jainism. We're all a minority. Christianity is a minority, Catholicism more so. What makes it interesting in Bombay is that because Bombay is the center of Indian Hindi cinema, a lot of understanding of what the Christians are comes from the Bombay Catholics in cinema. So what I grew up seeing was Catholics being stereotyped and portrayed in a certain way in the movies, often as alcoholics, drunk alcoholics, sometimes wearing these really large rosaries and earrings that were actually the symbol of the cross. But none of this was really true. I think the idea of Catholics being alcoholics came from two things. Firstly, because you had wine in church. Secondly, because in the 60s and 70s, when the prohibition was imposed in Bombay, a lot of these Catholic women and because they came from poorer households, they became very enterprising and started selling alcohol at, home-brewed alcohol in their houses. And these places where they sold were usually in their houses, and it was called auntie joints, or basically where you went and drank, had a shot of liquor and maybe something to munch on. And the Catholic aunties also came to, or the women came to embody this trait or personality where they were very loud, very domineering, and loved feeding the world alcohol. But that was not what Christianity was about. So growing up, I felt very misrepresented, almost invisibilized. And I didn't see a lot of literature until very recently. We have, works from writers like Jerry Pinto, who've been doing phenomenal work when it comes to writing about being, he doesn't necessarily talk about Catholics, but he writes about characters who are Christian. But I didn't see that a lot when I was growing up. And I felt that there was very little authenticity in the stories that were being peddled. And one of the reasons why I wanted to write Bombay Baljao was to, at least for other Christians in and around Bombay, to feel represented or see stories that are relatable, and also for the non-Catholics to understand what the Christian way of life really is. And I think in that way, my religion did inform my writing.
Thank you. Randy?
I was thinking about that concept of stereotype, the way you were describing it, but I certainly had a different experience of it growing up in enthusiastically multicultural Canada. And the reason I mention that is the first time I can remember is when I was working on my first novel. I was in graduate school in the US at that point, and I came back and I met my agent for the first time in person. And he said to me, I need to show you to people because marketable, right? And so I had a very strong reaction against that and had very little interest in writing about Sri Lankan experience, religious experience in my first couple of novels, certainly my first one especially. And then with Original Prin, the first in this trilogy, the novel begins with this middle-class family driving its Volvo to a working-class, lower-middle-class part of Toronto to go to Mass on New Year's Day. And it's a brown parish. Everyone inside is Sri Lankan or from some part of South Asia, and it's packed. And everyone is overdressed, but all the kids are wearing Air Jordans because it's Christmas and they all got their shoes. But I set this scene up, and then after the novel came out, I was interviewed by a South Asian journalist in Toronto. And she said she was really grateful for the way that I represented religion in the novel. And I said, well, what do you mean? She said, well, to be clear, I'm a journalist, I'm secular, but the reason why she enjoyed it was she said it was so refreshing to read a novel that involves South Asians, and the way she put it was, there are no monks floating in trees, like the kind of exotic version of religion, right? If you think about South Asian writing and how popular, certainly after something like The Goddess of Small Things, after books like that and Rushdie, a certain sense of magic, mystical India, very orientalizing. And so I think the kind of lived everyday experience of ordinary South Asian and intersecting with Catholic life is something that has certainly become much more of interest to me. And then as a result, and again, when we go out for lunch, notice how many brown people there are in Rome, right? But they're all at a certain level, but they're everywhere. And when you start to see it that way, then you realize that a majority of these folks, I suspect, are here as temporary workers. And where do you see them gather? You see them gather sometimes in churches, right, where you would see a different configuring of community. And so that, as opposed to monks floating in trees, is kind of what interests me. Over to Rex.
I think that means you, Naresh. Rex, you're up. You touched upon it already, Naresh, a little bit about this, but anything you wanted to add just about that sense of what it means to be a Catholic journalist, critic, but also very much doing the political, cultural, social scene of an entire nation city?
Yes, sir. In addition to what Jane was saying about sort of the Bollywood stereotype of Christianity, I think the dominant stereotype in India in 2023 is the Christian who is using illegitimate means to convert populations. One of the consequences of Hindu majoritarianism has been an attack on minorities, Muslims most of all, and the stereotype of Muslims is that they are converting Hindu women through a sly tactic that is called love jihad. There are many jihads that evidently Indian Muslims are waging. They are waging a fertilizer jihad, where they are using more fertilizer than Hindu farmers to increase their production and dominate the Indian agricultural sector. They are sometimes waging a flood jihad by when it rains excessively, they are breaking down embankments and flooding up Hindu areas. But worst of all, they are waging a love jihad, where Muslim men are courting Hindu women, unsuspecting Hindu women, and converting them and falling in love with them, getting them to fall in love with these Muslims in order to convert them. And this is sort of the Muslim stereotype. And the Christian stereotype is that we are all getting money straight from that room where you all are sitting in Rome to convert unsuspecting Hindus. And this has actually resulted in great violence. There are not so much to those of us in the cities of Western India, but just outside of Delhi, for instance, there have been a series of attacks recently almost every Sunday on people gathering in prayer halls in the state of Uttar Pradesh. Since May the 3rd, there have been about 40 or 50 churches that have been attacked in the state of Manipur in a very complicated tribal conflict. But the Kuki tribe, who have been under siege, also happen to be Christian. In the northeastern states of India, there are some states that are more than 90% Christian. And this has led to a great deal of suspicion. Even though the Indian Constitution gives us the freedom to propagate our religion, many states in India, those ruled now by the BJP, have passed what they call anti-conversion laws. And people who they claim have been converted by force, the person whose congregation they belong to, who has effected the conversion, can be jailed for very long periods of time. And so this is the situation under which now we conduct our journalism. It's journalism and essay writing and sort of writing novels and poetry that isn't just defending the freedoms of Christians. It's defending all human freedoms, the freedoms that make us the democratic societies we are. And so that falls to us as journalists and as Christian journalists.
Thank you so much. I was just at a meeting in Boston last summer with Indian Jesuits. There are more Jesuits in the order from India than any other place in the world. And we were having a wonderful conversation about how important the word secularism and secular is to them, because it gives them the opportunity to have the 50 or so schools that they run in India, that they're worried that might be taken out of the Constitution, and then, of course, their schools would close. So here we had a bunch of American Jesuits talking about, the problems of secularism, the problems, they're like, no, we love secularism. That's saving us for this kind of nurturing kind of place. We just have a little bit. I was thinking of G.K. Chesterton and Andrew Greeley from yesterday, who Chesterton makes this, and I'm not sure how true it is. Chesterton was a bit bombastic, but he was suggesting that Hinduism was the cousin of Christianity or Catholicism, right? Isn't it an orthodoxy, I think? In the sense that there was that sense of being able to baptize all of creation in some kind of syncretic way, that there's differences, but there's something about that. And I was just wondering about your own experience of that, and maybe we have a question or two from the audience. Is there that sense of do you see them actually kind of moving in the same direction, or are they always kind of, besides Modi and his government, is there a way that you see them actually kind of companioning as a cultural kind of representation and manifestation?
I see these divisions only coming to the fore very recently, and like Naresh pointed out with Mr. Modi's politics and that of the BJP. But I am a practicing Catholic, so is my father, but very interestingly, because he has a lot of Ganesh idols. Ganesh is a Hindu god in our house, and that really kind of confuses any priest who comes to our house, because we have an altar where you have Mother Mary, Jesus Christ, and crucifix, and right on the side you have this real big Ganesh idols, and there are so many of them because he's a collector. He also prays to Ganesha because he believes that in some way, I think his career, because he started making these small, he started designing these, he's an architect and interior designer, and he started designing these little Ganesh pandals, or what you call places or altars where you place the Ganesh idol. So he's someone who reveres the god. And growing up, even I was very confused why we had two gods, because the 10 Commandments one of the commandment says that you shouldn't have any God before me. But I grew up in a house where we learn to respect and revere all gods. And I think this is the society that India is in a way. When Naresh lives in Bandra, and there is this real big fest called the Mount Mary Festival, where it's a shrine, a Mother Mary shrine, and every year in September, for those 21 days, you have people from all walks of life coming there. It's packed to the brim, and I'm sure it's causing a lot of traffic problems in Bandra. Naresh would be able to share better, but you have people from all walks of life even today. It's unfortunate what's happening, and as journalists, we can see that very evidently. I remember covering the story of Father Stan Swami, who was a Jesuit. He passed away in a hospital 2 years ago, and it was very tragic how an 80-something-year-old priest who'd spent his life working for the cause of the tribals was suddenly dragged in a case where there was very little support for him, I feel, even from the community. It was something that only because people are scared. In general, people are very scared. His passing away and the very fact that this could happen to a priest like him really shocked us to the core. So it is happening, unfortunately, but the true Indian spirit is very different, I'm sure.
I'll just make a Jesuit connection via Canada. There's a place called the Martyr Shrine north of Toronto, and it was the site of the martyrdom of St. John de Brebeuf and St. Isaac Jogues and others. And it is the pilgrim church for all ethnic groups in Toronto. So Italian, Irish, Slovenian, etc. Everybody goes there on a feast day in the summer, and then it's a picnic, etc. So this includes Catholics from Sri Lanka, for whom our version, what you were just describing, is Our Lady of Madhu. It's a shrine in the jungle in Sri Lanka, and every August there's this big festival, a caravan, everyone goes out there. Both my parents can remember doing this growing up. My father, growing up Buddhist, would still do it. And in Toronto, you have this same feast that takes place. The majority of Sri Lankans who go there are Hindu, and it just causes chaos because the way they negotiate the church in the middle of a mass is very different than perhaps how all of us would. And so there's just constant movement, people on their knees, approaching the altar, putting money on various statues. And then you've got, these kind of 65-year-old Knights of Columbus guys from small town Canada saying, hey, you got to stop doing that there. Come on. And then, so it's total chaos. But the interesting thing for me is the Sri Lankan version of the sectarian problems that you're describing. There are 2 Sri Lankan feast days at the Martyr Shrine, one for Tamil Catholics from Sri Lanka and one for Sri Lankan Catholics because of the long-standing civil war in Sri Lanka, which ended about 10 years ago, but those divisions remain. So even though everyone is Catholic, you go up on a different day depending on your ethnicity from Sri Lanka, right? The kind of the nuances that still play out in the quote-unquote New World.
Should we open it up to some questions, maybe? We have just about 5 minutes. Is there a question from the audience? Yeah, Ana Luisa.
Thank you so much for this wonderful panel. And I have a question about St. Anthony of Padua. Why St. Anthony? In the last year, I've been working on Catholic missions in West Africa, and particularly Ghana. And I noticed that there are so many similarities between Ghana, India, and Brazil, the transatlantic missionary trajectories. And one of the similarities that I found particularly interesting is that when the Catholic were chased by the Dutch, both the African people, in particular in Ghana and in India, the people saved all the Catholic paraphernalia, including statue of St. Anthony, for more than 200 years. And that veneration for the saint was particularly important for the formations of what became also contemporary Catholicism. What is your experience and about the saint and the veneration of saints, and how are saints venerated today? Because, for example, in Ghana, it became a very strong political issue. Venerating a saint, a Catholic saint, also had an important, it was a statement, also political statement. How was the veneration of saints and Catholicism, also popular Catholicism, particularly shaped in India? And in Sri Lanka, where I know that St. Anthony is particularly venerated.
Yeah, we might give that to Naresh first, just because of his piece on St. Francis Xavier seems to have explored that. Naresh, would you want to answer that? Did you hear the question?
No, I couldn't hear anything. I'm hearing best on Jane's mic. Jane, could you repeat that, please?
You can hear me?
Yeah, I can hear your mic the clearest. I couldn't hear the question at all. Could you sort of sum that up, please? Or somebody else take the question.
Can you hear me okay, Naresh? Yes, you can hear me? No, apparently, so you will. Jane, take the question.
So Naresh, the question that was asked was about how the veneration of saints is in India. What is the culture? Then I think you can answer that vis-a-vis St. Francis Xavier.
The veneration of saints.
Yes.
How does it work within
How does it work in India?
Oh, yes. And it is something that, it does amuse me greatly, especially Francis Xavier. I've now seen in my essay, I sort of, which I sent over, it was about trying to find the various pieces of Francis Xavier scattered across the globe. There's one bit of his elbow in the Church of Gesù in Rome. The bit I haven't yet seen is his intestines in Nagasaki, which is motivation enough for me to try to get save my rupees and go off to Japan at some stage. But this sort of the Catholicism has incorporated in India the veneration of saints, as it is in many other parts of the world, in a very Indian way. If you were to go, for instance, to Velankani in Tamil Nadu, which is the site of a Marian apparition, you would think you were in a temple town. Catholics go there and shave their heads, the men, exactly in the way you do if you were going to visit a temple on pilgrimage. And you offer marigold flowers, for instance, in many Indian churches. So yes, Indian Catholics and I think South Asian Catholics have sort of incorporated worship practices from the faiths. This was part of, again, that moment I was talking about in the 1960s of enculturation, where many Catholic priests, especially in Western India, shed their white robes and began to use saffron robes or saffron shawls. Instead of an offertory, there was the traditional Indian practice of the arti with frankincense, with incense sticks and marigold flowers. So yeah, this sort of all feeds into how we are trying to celebrate Catholicism, celebrate our faith, rooted in the subcontinent.
Thank you so much. We have to stop there so we can get to our next panel, our next discussion. I really want to thank you, Jane. Thank you, Randy, for coming up. And Naresh, thank you for joining us all the way from Mumbai.